Hey everybody! Welcome back to The Remnant. We're back with the book readings. Sorry it took so long. I was, as I like to say, being a loser and not wanting to do it. So, I'm back. And I'm ready to do it. And, yeah. I'm excited. We're gonna finally finish the society. I know it's been, forever since I did it. But, we're gonna go ahead and finish most of the society. Today, it's a marathon. A marathon of the society. Chapter 6 through 9. It's gonna be a lot of fun. Hopefully my throat doesn't give out. And hopefully I remember the voices. So, with that being said, Lord have mercy on my soul. I don't know if you guys can hear that in the background, but there is a monster truck outside rumbling. I apologize. It's not my fault. But every time you try to record something, something happens. I'm sure people know. So if you hear anything in the background, just please ignore it. Please. Thank you. Oh, now it's done. Alright. Let's get into the book. I'm sure you don't want to hear me rambling. Chapter 6 of the Society. Oh, by the way, I should probably do a little recap before I go in. We left off on a part where Beck and Scott noticed that they're not just dealing with anything. They noticed that the Ouija board and a lot of the other things that's happening is not normal. It's definitely occult. And they finally noticed that they're dealing with demons. And that's where we left off. If you don't really know what happened, or if you forgot, just head on back to the last couple of videos. Sorry. And yeah, here we go. We're gonna go ahead and start with chapter 6. Let's go. The following morning, Becca stumbled down the stairs to join her family at the breakfast table. "Hey, Buckwheat," Scott called, between stuffing his face with spoonfuls of Kix. "What'll it be? Kix without milk or no milk with Kix?" Becca scowled at him through puffy eyes. She definitely was not a morning person. Unfortunately, Scott was. And for some reason, he seemed to think it was his personal mission to make sure everyone was as cheery as he was. "I'm sorry," Mom said, referring to the lack of milk. "I promise, as soon as things settle down and I get a job, we'll be back to normal." "Any leads yet?" Scott asked. "A couple," Mom said, grabbing some juice from the fridge and pouring it. "Should know in a day or so." Once again, Becca felt a sadness creep over her. Mom always worked so hard to keep everyone happy. Even when Dad had died, she'd spend more time making sure the kids were okay than she ever spent on herself. Sometimes, Becca marveled at Mom's strength and ability to give. Other times, it made her feel sad and even a little guilty. "Did either of you leave that door open last night?" Mom asked, motioning toward the kitchen door leading to the garage. Scott and Rebecca both shook their heads. "That's funny. I came down about 1:30 last night and it was standing wide open." Becca's eyes shot to the door. "And there was this strange sound." "Sorry," Mom said, glancing to her daughter. "Kind of like you described when you were moving the boxes." Becca froze. She threw a look to Scott, but he was too busy eating to notice. Sorry, I had to silence my phone. We'll go back to it. Becca froze. She threw a look to Scott, but he was too busy eating to notice. She cleared her throat and tried her best to sound casual. "Did you see anything?" "Well, no," Mom answered. "Not that I really tried. I just sort of shut the door, locked it, and ran for my life." She chuckled a little embarrassed. Scott gave a snort. Becca said nothing. Mom had enough worries. She didn't need any more. But Becca's mind was racing again, trying to piece it all together. The amulet, the Ascension Lady, the attacks against Scott, the demons. And now this, a door that she definitely had locked, was now unlocked and standing wide open. Was there a connection between these things? Probably not. But still. She gave another look at the door. It was shut and securely locked. And that was good enough for now. At least, she hoped so. Excuse me. Sorry, excuse me. Scott continued climbing up the bleachers, stepping on more than one pair of feet. Hey, watch it, hairball! It was a skateboard kid. Hey, how you doing, Scott said, then continued on. Excuse me. Pardon me. Sorry. He had tried to talk to Daryl all morning, but the little guy would have nothing to do with him. Every time he saw Scott coming from one direction, he'd head the other. Until now. Now, they were all taking their seats for some sort of assembly and anti-drugs or crime don't pay 'cause prison's the pits talk. Every school has them, where some guy comes in and rambles on about messing up his life because he did what he did and how you should never do it because if you do, you'll mess up your life just as he did. At any rate, everyone was gathered to listen. After crawling over a dozen more people in tows, ouch! Sorry, watch it! Finally, Scott managed to squeeze in next to Daryl. What are you doing here? Daryl squeaked. His eyes darted around nervously. We've got to talk, Scott answered. Not here. Not in the open. You've been avoiding me all day. Before they could continue, Principal Slater had everyone stand for the flag salute. Next, he introduced their guest speaker. Assistant Police Chief somebody or other. He was a heavy man with a great sense of humor, but Scott and Daryl weren't laughing. The reason was simple. They weren't listening. All I'm saying, Scott whispered, is if those kids are moving that Ouija board, pointer, by themselves, then something else is moving it. Duh, Daryl said sarcastically. Of course something is moving it. Spirits. Scott was stunned. You mean you know about them? Of course. And you actually fool around with them? That's the whole point, brainless. We call up the spirits of the dead and ask them all sorts of... The dead? Scott interrupted so loudly that Miss Penderson, a teacher 4 rows down, turned around and scowled. Scott gave an apologetic nod, then continued more softly. Those aren't spirits of the dead people, Daryl. What are they, then? Demons. Demons? Daryl half cried, half squeaked. Again, Miss Penderson turned and glared. Again, the boys looked to her apologetically. This time, there were also a few snickers from nearby students. The two guys looked ahead, pretending to be interested in the assistant chief's speech. Something about locking up your bicycles, but they could only fake it for a few moments. Excuse me, I have to sneeze. Lord have mercy. Sorry, apologies. I forgot where I was. Okay, the two guys looked ahead, pretending to be interested in the assistant chief's speech. Something about locking up your bicycles. But they could only fake it for a few moments. Soon, Daryl was leaning back over to Scott and whispering, They can't be demons. Why not? Because they say they're dead people. They give us their names. They're lying. How do you know? Daryl asked. The dead can't come back and talk to us. It's impossible. Who says? The Bible. The Bible? This time Daryl was so loud that the assistant police chief stopped and looked toward their section. I'm sorry, was there a question? More kids chuckled, but not Miss Penderson. No, Chief, she said, rising to her feet. Just a couple of rather ill-mannered children. I do apologize. She turned to Scott and Daryl and motioned for them to join her. There were plenty more snickers as Scott and Daryl got up and headed down the bleachers to join Miss Penderson. Without a word, she escorted them toward the door. The assistant chief resumed his speech, but of course everyone was too busy shaking their heads and chuckling to hear what he said. What do you mean, evil? Julie grinned. Rebecca didn't grin back. You're not serious, are you? Julie asked. Becca swallowed hard and gave half a shrug. All day she'd worked up the courage to tell Julie about the amulet. Now as they headed down the hall toward the locker room and practice, it seemed as good a time as any. There weren't too many people around, and if she made a fool of herself, it would at least be in private and not... Hey, Chrissy! Julie called across the hall. Listen to this! So much for privacy. Yeah, what's up? Chrissy asked, joining them. Becca here's got something to tell you. Once again, Becca took a deep breath. The girls waited. Finally, she started. It's just that those charms you're wearing... She's talking about our lucky pouches, Julie interrupted. She says they're evil, satanic. It was Chrissy's turn to grin. Becca looked to the floor. Her face grew hot. I don't know about evil, Chrissy said brightly, but they're definitely satanic, sure. Becca snapped her head back, up in surprise. Chrissy continued to smile. Oh, don't worry. Not satanic like the mean old devil with a pitchfork, but satanic like they're supposed to unlock the deeper forces of nature or something like that. At least that's what Priscilla said. Priscilla? Becca asked. Yeah, Julie answered. The Ascension lady who makes this stuff. The lady at the bookshop? Becca asked. Yeah, Chrissy nodded. She says she's a witch, but a good witch. You know, someone who uses the forces for good. Hey, I gotta go. Philip's gonna surprise me with this incredible earring with a diamond and everything. If it's a surprise, then how do you know what it is? Julie asked. I'm a professional hint dropper. Chrissy laughed as she turned and headed back up the hall. Julie shook her head in amusement, until she saw the concerned look on Becca's face. Lighten up, she said as she pushed open the locker room door. Chrissy's an airhead. You know that. Nobody believes in witches and that junk. My pouch is just a lucky charm, like a rabbit's foot. Becca opened her mouth, but couldn't find the words. The tension wasn't as bad as Scott feared. Nothing like in the movies where the hero sits next to the all-school bully who's just waiting to turn his face into a pizza topping. Nope, the tension was just Scott and Daryl sitting in the library for 1 hour after school. And Mr. Lowry, the librarian, was so cool he didn't even care if they talked, as long as they kept it down. So, what makes you an expert in all this stuff? This spirit stuff? Daryl asked, sniffing and pushing up his glasses. We lived in South America, Scott bragged. Pride wasn't a huge problem with him. Just big enough. Yeah, we had to deal with this occult lots of times. Occult? You know, demons, Satan, that kind of garbage. Oh, did weird stuff ever happen? Oh, sure. Scott pretended to yawn. We had to deal with this stuff all the time. A definite exaggeration. He'd only heard the stories from missionaries and his dad. He hadn't actually seen anything for himself. Even so, Scott's words did the trick. Daryl's eyes grew as big as saucers. Weren't you ever, scared? Nah. By now, Scott had crossed the line from exaggeration to lying. So he tried to pull it back a little. Actually, he cleared his throat. Mom and Dad, they were the ones who usually handled it when these things happened. He noticed a trace of disappointment crossing Daryl's face, so he quickly threw in, but the Bible says any Christian can beat that stuff. Yeah? Scott nodded. Jesus gave us authority over Satan and all demons. He was still bragging, but at least this part was the truth. So, Daryl mumbled, mostly to himself, that's why they're doing it. Who's they? Scott asked. Doing what? Huh? Daryl glanced up. He looked a little sheepish. Nothing. I just, Who are you talking about? Scott held his gaze. No one. Come on, Daryl. Who's doing what? What's going on? Daryl faltered. Scott pressed in, refusing to back down. You know, don't you? You know what's going on. Daryl looked down at the table and finally nodded. Scott waited. It's the society. They said the spirits or demons or whatever told them to hassle you. Why? Daryl shrugged. I guess 'cause they're afraid of you. The demons? Scott asked, a little surprised. Again, Daryl nodded. The pieces slowly started to fit together. So, it's... Scott hesitated. Daryl finished his thought. It's the society that's doing all the stuff to you, yeah. Not the Ouija board or something weird. Daryl nodded. The way I hear it, the picture that beamed you yesterday is about $20 richer. Scott listened on. Part of him was relieved. No one likes to think there are spirits out to get him, but part of him was also growing angry. Daryl continued. They wanted to scare you to make sure you wouldn't come back. No problem there, Scott said quietly. Yeah, but... Scott looked up. Daryl was doing his own bit of thinking. If you're so much stronger, if you're that much of a threat, I mean, you could go in there and really show them your stuff, couldn't you? Scott was flattered and cautious at the same time. Well, I don't think... Okay, guys. Oh, excuse me. Okay, guys. It was Mr. Lowry. Your time is up. You're free to go home. The boys looked at the clock in surprise. It was the fastest hour they've ever spent. I trust you'll be a little more courteous the next time we have guests, he said. The kids nodded as they gathered their stuff and headed toward the door. But the conversation wasn't over. The way I see it, Daryl gave another sniff. Either you're stronger than these demon guys or you're not. No question, Scott insisted. Jesus said he gave us power and authority over all, and then you need to prove it. What do you mean, prove it? Daryl shoved open the library door, and they stepped into the hall. Either Jesus is lying when he says you're stronger, or he's telling the truth. The only way to know for certain is by going back to the society and proving it. Daryl, I don't think that's... What's the matter? You're not chicken, are you? Scott bristled at the word. No, it's not that. His mind raced, wondering how he got himself into this predicament, and more important, how he get himself out. Then I'll tell the rest of the kids, and we'll see if they want a showdown. Daryl nodded to himself. as if the decision was made. He pushed open the outside doors and they stepped into the late afternoon sun. "Daryl," Scott said, "I don't think that's such a good—" "It should be cool," Daryl interrupted. "Everybody will be there." Before Scott could protest, a horn honked. "That's my mom," Daryl said as he turned and started toward the approaching van. "I'll let you know what's happening as soon as I hear it," saw anything. "Daryl, I don't think—" But Daryl wasn't listening. "Daryl! Daryl!" Daryl opened the van door and immediately his mom began yelling at him for getting into trouble. He gave Scott a roll of the eyes. "Parents! Sheesh!" and slammed the door. Scott stared after the van as it sped off. Then he glanced down to his fingernails. He was gnawing on them again. "You shot off your big mouth again, didn't you, Scotty? Beck, someday that pride of yours is really going to get you in hot water." "I think I'm ready there." Rebecca sat down on his bed. Cornelius hopped off his perch and started walking up her leg. "Doesn't the Bible say we're not supposed to test God and stuff?" she asked. "Nobody's testing God," Scott said with a sigh. He snapped on the computer and typed in Nightlight's address to see if he had any messages. "But somebody's got to prove those morons who's the strongest." "And that somebody's gonna be you?" Scott shrugged. Rebecca rolled her onto her back and stared at the ceiling. "Why wasn't I an only child?" she moaned. "Hey, check it out," Scott said. "I got another message from Z." He brought it up onto the screen. With the slightest sigh, Becca sat up and read over Scott's shoulder. "To New Kid. Another way of proving supernatural contact through the Ouija board is in the number of possession cases. Here's the rest of the information I promised. Psychics and parapsychologists have received letters from hundreds of people who have experienced possession, an invasion of their personalities. Reverend Donald Page, a well-known clairvoyant and exorcist of the Christian Spiritualist Church, is reported as saying that most of his possession cases are people who have used the Ouija board, and that this is one of the easiest and quickest ways to become possessed. New Kid, when a person is possessed, a demon has come inside a person and is controlling him or her. I warn you, this is not something to play with. Exercise extreme caution. Z." Scott let out a low whistle, and he and Becca exchanged looks. "He's right, Scotty. This is serious stuff." "I know," he said with a heavy sigh. "But Christians still have the power, right? I mean, I can still show them who's boss." Rebecca looked to her little brother. Once again, she wasn't sure what to say. All she was sure of was the uneasiness she felt growing inside. Woo! That was crazy. Crazy! Now we're on to Chapter 7. This is going to be a really long video, but I hope you enjoy it. Chapter 7. Ha! They hit you pretty hard, didn't they, son? It was another dream. Scott lay flat on his back in the middle of the football field. His dad was still in his suit of armor as he offered him his hand. Scott took it and slowly rose to his feet. He knew he was dreaming, but with all this talk of spirits and demons and communicating with the dead, he still had to be sure. "You're not really my dad, are you?" The man burst out laughing. "Of course not, Scotty. I'm just a memory of your dad. Your dad's in heaven with the Lord. You know that." Scott nodded. "I'm just your imagination, trying to get you to remember something." "Well, for an imagination, you look pretty real." "Thanks," the man smiled, wiping a smudge off his metal breastplate. "Now tell me, why didn't you use your shield? Or one of our plays?" I I don't remember any plays, Scott sighed. Of course you remember, his dad chuckled. We read from the playbook every day. Scott stared. What plays are you talking about? What playbook? The one your mother and I read to you and Becca at the breakfast table. We never read any playbook at any breakfast. Sure we did. Dad, the only thing we ever read at the table was... Suddenly, Scott stopped. Wait a minute! They did read something at the table. Nearly every day. But it wasn't a football playbook. Scott looked at his father. Are you talking about the Bible? Is that what you're trying to get me to remember? The man grinned. Bingo. Now, we haven't got much time, so let's head back in there. They turned and started toward the line of scrimmage. Once again, it was the two of them against an entire squad of shadow giants. But as Scott looked up, the shadows suddenly disappeared. Now he clearly saw their faces. They were the kids from the society. The chubby girl in black, the red-haired beauty, and the meaty guy in a tank top. They were all there in front of him. They were bigger. Much, much bigger. But it was definitely them. Scott's mind spun as he tried to figure out what was going on. Sure, their family read the Bible, but what did that have to do with the football? Or do with football, excuse me. Or with these kids who were looming over him like oversized gorillas. Gorillas waiting to turn him into a human hamburger. Dad took his position over the ball and waited for Scott's signal. The society dug in their cleats, waiting to make the kill. Scott took a deep breath. Oh well, he thought. It's only a dream, right? He crouched behind his dad and yelled, Ready? Say hike! Dad snapped the ball, but it wasn't a ball, and it wasn't a shield either. Not this time. This time Scott was holding a sword. A sword with all sorts of words and letters on it. The society sprung toward him, grunting and growling. Remember the playbook! Dad shouted. Use your sword! Use your sword! Scott dropped back. The society giants thundered toward him. Remember the playbook! Lord have mercy. Use your sword! Scott was at a loss. He had no idea what to do. The meaty guy was the first to hit him, knocking out all his wind. Oof! Scott gasped. The others followed, one after another, leaping on top of him, stomping him, crushing him. Scott screamed, but nobody heard. Nobody cared. There was only his pain and the society as they continued piling on top of him, one after another, grinding his body into the mud. Ah! He screamed again. Ah! Scotty! Scotty! Wake up! It was Mom. What was she doing on the field? Scotty, you're having a nightmare. Scotty, wake up! Wake up! Scott's eyes fluttered open. He was sweating and gasping. But at least the pain was gone and he was back in his room. At least he was no longer football roadkill. His mom was on the edge of his bed, holding his shoulders tightly, her eyes filled with concern. Are you all right? She asked gently. I heard you screaming. Yeah, Scott said, trying to catch his breath. I think so. I just... It was a dream. About Dad. His voice trailed off, and when tears jumped to his eyes, he was too tired to hold them back. His mom pulled him close and held him. I know, Scotty, she said. I know. I miss him too. Scott wasn't sure how long they sat holding each other, but he didn't care. All he knew was that he needed it. They both needed it. Ooh, crazy. Let's continue on. The next morning, Scott was still trying to figure out the dream as he stood at his locker, dialing the combination. It's all set. It's all set, Daryl's voice squeaked. What? Scott glanced up. Hi, Daryl. The society has agreed to meet you at the bookshop after school. Today? Well, of course today. You're ready, right? Listen, Daryl, You're not chickening out? No, it's not that. It's good, because they said you would. They said... Hold it, Scott interrupted. They said I'd chicken out? Sure. They said you'd be afraid to take them on. Daryl gave a louder than normal sniff. Scott could feel himself getting angry. Before he knew it, he shot back. You tell them I'm not afraid of anybody. He slammed the locker shut. You tell them I'll be there. With that, he turned and stormed off. Great! Daryl called out after him. It's gonna be great! Scott slowly let out his breath. He wished he could agree, but he was already feeling lousy. Why couldn't he keep his big mouth shut? Let me get this straight, Chrissy said, almost letting a frown wrinkle the perfect skin on her perfect forehead. You're saying if we keep wearing these things, we're gonna become like the girl in The Exorcist? Julie and the other kids at the lunch table snickered. Once again, Julie had brought the subject up, and once again, Becca was having to defend herself. All I'm saying is that some witch doctors use those charms to control other people. What exactly do you mean by control? Ryan asked. His blue eyes looked at her intently. Becca was grateful that at least one person seemed to be taking her seriously. She means like demon possessions, Philip explained. Becca shook her head. Not really. It's just the way witch doctors get people to depend on their charms instead of themselves. Or God. You really know witch doctors? Chrissy asked. Wow! Julie exclaimed. Rebecca could tell they were getting off the subject, but before she could get them back on, she noticed Philip. His body was going rigid. He was becoming stiff as a board. Julie laughed and slapped him on the arm. Knock it off, Philip! But Philip did not respond. For a moment, there was a look of panic on his face. Then it totally went blank. His eyes rolled up into his head, and he started choking. Philip! Chrissy scolded. She was certain he was clowning. Well, almost certain. But as the choking continued, Becca thought he might be having some sort of seizure. Maybe it was epilepsy, or... She tried to push back the thought. Something worse. Philip! Chrissy was louder now, and frightened. That's not very funny, Philip! The choking increased until it sounded inhuman. Like some monster or alien. The kids from the surrounding tables stopped their conversations and turned to stare. Philip! Knock it off, Philip! Ryan snickered. He didn't believe it was true. But then Philip spoke. Well, at least Philip's mouth spoke. His voice was different. Deeper. Sinister. Philip is no longer here. We have control now. Philip! Chrissy shook him, but he didn't react. Philip, answer me! Her voice grew louder. What do you want with him? Who are you? Our needs are simple. Who are you? Where's Philip? Our needs are simple. The voice repeated. What do you want? Pass the salt. Please, this hamburger casserole is gross. There was a moment of stunned silence. Then everyone broke into laughter. Philip, Ryan, Julie, everybody roared. Well, almost everybody. Chrissy was busy giving Philip a punch to the arm. Then there was Becca. "Excuse me," she mumbled hoarsely as she rose and quickly dashed from the table. "Becca!" Ryan called. "Hey, Becca, it was just a joke. Come on back." Rebecca wasn't coming back. She wasn't mad. She just didn't want them to see the tears filling her eyes. Pause. That demon voice kind of hurt my throat. And I bet you guys got too. I'm sure you guys thought he got possessed too. Ah, Lord have mercy. I don't know how voice actors do this for a living. Just doing these crazy voices. Anyways, let's continue on. As they approached the bookshop, Scott was nervous, actually scared spitless. But not for long. The handsome, middle-aged woman was no longer there. She had been replaced by some pimply-faced high school kid. "Where's Priscilla?" Daryl asked. She, said she had some errands to run. She'll be back after the, he motioned to Scott. You know, after you guys are through. "She didn't want to be here?" Daryl squeaked in surprise. "She didn't want to see the fireworks?" The guy shrugged. "I'm just telling you what she said." "Cool." Daryl gave a loud sniff as they passed the counter and headed down the hall. "What's cool?" Scott asked. "She doesn't want to meet you." "Who?" "Priscilla, the lady who runs this place." "Why not?" "Sounds like she might be afraid." "Yeah?" Scott could feel a twinge of the old pride returning. Daryl sniffed again. "Maybe you have too much power for her to handle." Suddenly, Scott was feeling more confident. Somehow, he seemed to be standing just a little bit taller, his chest swelling just a bit bigger. Who knew? Maybe he'd call fire down out of the sky to burn up the Ouija board. He'd read something like that in the Bible. Or maybe he'd make the kids unable to speak until they acknowledged God's power. He would read that too. He wasn't sure, but whatever he did, it would be awesome. They arrived at the door. It was closed. Daryl turned to him and pushed up his glasses. "You're sure you're ready?" Scott nodded. "Let's do it." Daryl sniffed. I slowly opened the door. Once again, the room was dark, except for the dozen or so candles flickering. Once again, the kids looked up. The chubby girl in black, the pretty redhead, and the meaty guy. There were plenty of other kids sitting around, too. More than Scott remembered from the last time. But that was okay. Obviously, they wanted to see the show. "Come on in," meaty guy said, trying to sound casual. He might have pulled it off if it wasn't for the way his voice quivered. Sorry. Scott smiled. He strode confidently into the room, and for good reason. The Ascension lady had run off. The kids were shaking in their boots, and he, Scott Williams, had the power of God behind him. Not a bad combination. This was going to be a piece of cake. Chapter 7 was pretty interesting, too. Let's see what Chapter 8 has in store for us. We're halfway through the little marathon I had planned. Let's see what Chapter 8 has. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. One lap to go. Becca counted. She concentrated. She did everything Julie taught her. Everything to keep focused on the 1600 they were completing. The prelims were tomorrow. She and Julie would run the mile, the half mile, and probably a couple of the longer sprints. Who knows? If she did well, she might even help Julie beat Royal High. But That wasn't the real reason she ran. Becca ran to forget the afternoon. She ran to forget the laughter, the snickers, the put-downs. Ever since Philip's little possession routine at the lunch table, word had spread. Suddenly everyone knew her as the church lady, the superstitious Christian who believed the devil lurked behind every shadow. 1, 2, 1, 2. Julie ran a half-dozen steps ahead. As usual, her rhythms were smooth and flowing. It infuriated Becca. Not Julie's running, but that Julie hadn't stood up for her. In fact, Julie was the one who started it, and she was still spreading it and enjoying it. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. Once again, Becca's lungs were on fire. But that was nothing compared to the anger smoldering in her heart. This was her reward for trying to help Julie? For trying to warn her? Total humiliation? Half a lap to go. What did Julie think? That because Becca was quiet, she didn't have feelings? That because they were friends, she could get away with that kind of junk? She looked ahead to Julie. Miss Perfect. Miss, I've got the great looks and money and friends. Who did she think she was anyway? Becca's anger continued to burn until an idea took root. She never thought she'd be able to take Julie. Julie was the expert, the teacher, the one destined to go to state. But there she was, not that far away, and with no sprint to rely on for the end. A strength surged through Rebecca, a strength connected with her anger. It started somewhere in her chest and flowed into her arms and legs. Her energy increased more than ever before, with 200 meters to go. It was too soon to begin her sprint. Way too soon. But it didn't matter. She started to count faster. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. She began closing the gap. Coach Simmons was the first to spot it. What's Becca doing? Others looked up and watched. Becca continued to count, to dig in. 100 meters to go. A couple of kids started to shout, to cheer her on. All right, Becca, go for it. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. Inch by inch, she moved up until she finally pulled beside Julie. The look of astonishment on the girl's face almost brought enough satisfaction to Becca. Almost. Who did she think she was anyway? Becca pushed harder. Julie panicked. For a moment, she lost her rhythm. Perfect. Rebecca inched ahead. 50 meters to go. Now it was an all-out race. Just the two of them. Becca was beyond exhaustion. Her lungs ached, but her rage was stronger than her pain. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. Julie tried to keep up, but she had no sprint. She fell 2 strides behind, then 3. Once again, Becca heard the girl break her rhythm, but she didn't look back. She didn't have to. 20 meters. Atta girl, Becca! Kids shouted. Kick it in, girl! Kick it in! 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. 10 meters. She could almost hear Julie's heart breaking. Good. 5 meters. Becca stretched and crossed the line, 6 strides ahead of Julie. She stumbled and practically fell as she came to a stop. But the team members were there to catch her and congratulate her. Way to go, girl! 5:51! Coach Simmons shouted. That was incredible! You too, Julie! She turned to Julie, who was standing behind her. 5:53! Your best time ever! You girls are going to stomp Royal tomorrow. Becca's hunched over, gulping air. She could hear Julie coughing and gasping beside her. But she didn't look. Instead, she rose, turned, and started for the showers. A couple more kids congratulated her, but Becca paid little attention. She had won. She had beaten Julie. And that was all that counted. Hey, Becca! Becca! It was Julie's voice. But Becca ignored her as she continued toward the showers. Revenge was sweet. More than sweet. It was glorious. And if she could do it today, she could do it tomorrow. Back at the bookshop, Meaty Guy continued with the opening remarks. So, how do you want to do this? Scott shrugged. It's your show. The redhead stepped forward. My name's Kara. This is James. She motioned to the Meaty Guy. And Brooke here. She's our president. The girl in black nodded. She was obviously the coolest and most collected of the group. At least that's how she looked at it on the outside. On the inside, Scott figured she was shaking, like the others. He approached the Ouija board, trying his best to appear calm. And why not? After all, he was holding all the cards. He glanced around the room, peering into the darkness. Then, motioning to the candles, he quipped, So, what's the deal? You guys forget to pay the electric bill? No one laughed. Not even a smile. So, they wanted to play hardball, did they? Fine. He could do that. Brooke spoke next. Daryl here says you think the society is a hoax. That we have no power. Not exactly, Scott corrected. I believe there's power here. Just the wrong type. Brooke looked on, waiting. Scott motioned to the Ouija board's pointer. If you guys aren't moving that thing around, then something else is. And that something else is definitely unfriendly. A brief silence hung over the room until Brooke finally answered. Granted, sometimes we wake a rather cranky spirit from the dead, but... No, hey, Scott broke in. She glared at him over the interruption, but he continued. Those aren't spirits of the dead you're talking to. If they're not spirits of the dead, she asked, then who are they? Scott shrugged. Just your average run-of-the-mill demons. And by demons you mean the bad guys, the angels that got kicked out of heaven with Satan. Brooke looked at him a moment. Interesting, was all she said. Truth, was all he said. After another pause, she continued. Yes, well, we'll see, won't we? With that, she placed her fingertips on the plastic pointer and nodded to Meaty Guy to do the same. There was a slight shuffling in the room as the kids moved in for a better view. Brooke threw back her head and closed her eyes. So, tell me, she said, still speaking to Scott. Who would you like to talk to? Got me. Scott forced a grin. How about Fred Flintstone? A couple kids chuckled. Get real, Meaty Guy scowled. It has to be somebody dead, like. But that was as far as he got. Suddenly, the pointer began to move. Meaty Guy's eyes shot down to it as he scooted across the board. Scott swallowed a wave of uneasiness. The chill was back, licking up his spine, crawling over his skin. The pointer continued to move, momentarily stopping over each letter until it spelled out the name. Bart Simpson. Meaty Guy stared at the board. I don't get it. Bart Simpson isn't real. He's a cartoon character, just like Fred. It's a joke, stupid, Brooke said, pretending to laugh. Then looking back to the board, she asked, Helen, is that you? Helen of Troy, are you here? Immediately, the pointer shot to the word yes. That's Helen of Troy, Brooke explained. She's got a great sense of humor. A regular Robin Williams, Scott smirked. There were a couple more chuckles from the back, but Brooke ignored them. Helen, she called, we have an unbeliever in our midst. Is there someone he can talk to? One of your friends who can help him achieve greater enlightenment? The pointer rested silently. Helen, are you still here? Again, no movement. Nothing. Helen, Brooke repeated, is there somebody here who can make him a believer? Please, tell us, anybody? Then ever so slowly, the pointer began to move. All eyes watched as it gradually spelled out the letters H-I-S. Then it stopped. Brooke looked at Scott. His? She asked. Do you know anyone who calls himself his? Scott shook his head, trying not to smile. Things were already falling apart, and they barely started. This was easier than he thought it would be. Maybe their initials, the redhead offered. You know, somebody with the initials H-I. She stopped as the pointer started moving again. The letters came much faster this time. F-A-T-H-E-R. Father, Meaty Guy exclaimed. His father? Brooke looked up to Scott. Is that true? Is your father dead? Scott felt a chill spread across his shoulder blades and onto his chest. He gave a little shudder. Well, yeah, sure, but anybody could know that. Brooke nodded and closed her eyes again. Helen, will his father speak to us? Scott shifted uneasily. Somewhere in the back of his neck, a dull ache began. But there was no answer. Helen? The pointer started to move again. All eyes watched as it spelled out the letters H-E-L-L-O-S-O-N. Hello, son. Scott took another swallow. You're gonna have to do better than that. He tried to smile, but he couldn't quite pull it off. What was his name? Brooke asked. Hubert, Scott lied. Actually, his dad was named after the Apostle Paul. Brooke turned back to the board and closed her eyes. Hubert, tell us what... Before she could finish, the pointer moved again. P-A-U-L. Paul. Scott sucked his breath in, as though he'd been punched in the gut. Brooke opened her eyes. Your dad's name isn't Hubert, it's Paul. Scott's heart started to pound in his ears. The ache in his neck creeped into his head and up to his temples. He took a deep breath and tried to relax. Yeah, I guess it is. For the first time since they'd met, the slightest trace of a smile formed on Brooke's lips. You still don't believe, do you? Scott searched for a snappy comeback but couldn't seem to find one. Ask him a question, the redhead said to Scott. Ask him something only the two of you would know. Scott's heart pounded louder in his ears. His head throbbed. It was getting hard to think, but he knew he had authority over these guys, so he could win. But how? Where to start? Go ahead, Daryl spoke up. Ask him something. Okay, Scott said nervously, clearing his throat. All right. Everyone waited as he thought. Finally, he had it. If you're really my father, he took another breath. If you're really my father, tell me what happened to my Swiss Army knife. It was a trick question. The Swiss Army knife was actually his dad's. Scott had bought it for him last Father's Day, but Scott fell so in love with it that he constantly borrowed it from his dad. It had become a joke between the two of them. Until his father's death. The pointer went into action and quickly replied, Notyous. not yours. Scott's jaw dropped as the answer continued to form. M-I-N-E. Mine. A lump grew in his throat. Before he knew it, Scott's eyes began to burn. Could it be? No one else would have known. Not Mom, not Becca, no one. Was it possible? For the past 6 months, he had longed for his father. But it was more than a longing, it was an ache. An ache that went all the way into his gut. And nothing, absolutely nothing could ease it. Oh, sure, he made his little jokes and pretended to have a good time, but underneath, the pain was always there. The man he adored, the man who had been the center of his life, had been suddenly and violently ripped away from him. And for 6 months, the pain had been unbearable. But now, his voice was thick, barely audible. Dad? He reached out to the table to steady himself. Dad, is it you? The pointer quickly spelled, "Tell Mom and Becca." The letters quickly continued to form, but Scott's eyes were filling with moisture so quickly that it was hard to see. He tried to blink back the tears, but they only came faster. By now his heart thundered in his ears, his head throbbed unbearably. His father was there, somewhere in the room, trying to communicate. His father, the one he thought he'd never, ever see again, was right there spelling out the words, "I miss you guys." "Oh, Dad." The phrase caught in Scott's throat. He choked back a quiet sob. He couldn't help himself. He tried to speak again, his voice hoarse with emotion, just above a whisper. "I miss you too, so much." And then, ever so gently, the pointer came to a stop. Scott looked on, waiting for more, but there was nothing. "Dad." His voice carried a trace of panic. "Dad, don't go!" No answer. "Dad! Dad, come back!" It was much louder, practically shouting. "There's so much we don't know! Dad!" Brooke turned to him. Her eyes had a glint of moisture in them. "I'm sorry, Scott. He's gone." "Dad!" Scott desperately scanned the room. "Dad! Dad! Don't go! Dad! Please come back! Dad!" But there was no answer. No movement on the board. No sound in the room. Only the uneasy cough of 1 or 2 kids. Everyone felt for him. Some looked to the ground in embarrassment. It's true. They'd won. They've proven the board's power, but at the moment, no one felt like celebrating. Scott's voice was fainter now, weaker. "Dad." He angrily wiped out the tears spilling onto his cheek, but there was no answer. Now we're on the last chapter that I'm doing for this little marathon, chapter 9. Let me just take a sip of water. What'd you think about that, though? That was kind of crazy, was it not? The first line of this chapter is exactly what I'm thinking. "I can't believe you thought it was Dad," Rebecca said as she paced back and forth in Scott's room. Mom had gone to bed hours ago, but they hadn't. The day had been brutal for both of them, and they were still up in his room comparing notes. Cornelius sat on his perch, sound asleep. "You had to be there," Scott insisted. "The Ouija board knew things. Like Dad's name, and that he died, like..." "Scotty, anybody could have known." "Like the Swiss Army knife I gave him for Father's Day?" Becca slowed her pacing and turned to him. "It knew that?" Scott nodded. He slumped down in front of the computer. After a lengthy silence, he punched up Z's info. Maybe he'd have some more info. Becca also had to sit. Slowly, she eased herself onto the bed. She missed Dad as much as Scott did. She still cried, usually at the most inconvenient times, but it didn't take much to set her off. Just some little memory or some little phrase that Dad had used, and suddenly, against her will, there were tears. How? She cleared the thickness in her voice. How could it be Dad when the Bible says? Her voice trailed off. I know, Scott sighed. The Bible says we die one time, then we go to face God. No dead souls haunting houses, no dropping in for late night seances. I don't know how to say this word, I'm going to try. Seances, something like that. You know what I'm trying to say. But it also says we're supposed to beat the bad guys. He hesitated a moment, then continued. I gotta tell you, Beck. After today, I'm not sure what I believe. Becca threw him a look. What was he saying? That the Bible was wrong? That he didn't trust it? Feeling her eyes on him, he shrugged. I call him like I see him. You get clobbered, I get clobbered. Then wind up talking to Dad. Doesn't it sound like what we've been told isn't all that accurate, is it? Rebecca took a long, deep breath and slowly let it out. All of their lives, they've been taught the Bible was true. But that was before their dad had died, and before Becca had become the laughingstock of the school, before Scotty started getting beat up. Before Dad started talking through a Ouija board, maybe they were wrong. Maybe the Bible wasn't... No. Becca pushed the thought out of her mind. Impossible. She refused to think it. Nothing from Z tonight, Scott said as he shut down the computer. Well, I guess we'd better hit the hay. Becca nodded and rose from the bed. Sweet dreams, she said half sarcastically. Yeah, maybe I'll have another crazy one about Dad and his suit of armor. Becca stopped at the door. You've been dreaming about Dad? Scott nodded. We're always playing football and he's always wearing the suit of armor. Armor? Weird, huh? Not for you, Scotty, she sighed. Nothing's too weird for you. He nodded. See you in the morning. She stepped into the hall, hesitated, then turned back. You know, Dad used to talk about armor. Scott looked at her. Yeah, she continued. Remember? Put on the armor of God. He used to tell us that, remember? A scowl crossed Scott's face. He did, didn't he? He walked over to the shelf near the door and picked up his Bible. Do you remember where that was? Here, let me. She took the book from his hands and quickly rifled through the pages. Ephesians something. Scott's mind churned. Wasn't that what the dream kept saying? Put on the armor? Put on the armor? Ah, here we go. Buck finally found it. Ephesians 6, verse 11. Listen. Put on all of God's armor, so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. Scott nodded. Satan was definitely pulling some tricks. All right. But what kind of armor was it talking about? Is there more? He asked. She continued. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the powers of this dark world. Rebecca quietly groaned. What's wrong? Scott asked. It's the way I treated Julie. Like she was the enemy. But she's not. She's the one I'm trying to save from the enemy. Scott nodded. But his mind was already on something else. Read that last part again. Becca backed up and repeated. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. course, Scott quietly whispered. Why didn't I see it? Becca looked to him, not understanding. He talked slowly, piecing it together as he spoke. If we're fighting against all these evil spirits, and if they're all around, don't you think at least one of them would have known about the army knife? Becca frowned. Run that past me again? If these demons are everywhere, then one of them must have heard me and Dad joking about the knife back in Brazil, back when he was alive. Rebecca began to nod. Then it wasn't Dad talking through the board. Scott nodded. It was a demon, just like we thought. Just like the Bible says. They looked at each other a long moment before Rebecca turned back to the page and continued reading. Therefore, put on the full armor of God, so that when the day of evil comes you may be able to stand your ground. We know that, Scott sighed impatiently. But what does it mean by armor? What type of armor? Hold it, Becca called as she silently read ahead. There's more. Listen to this. Take up the shield of faith with which you can extinguish all the flaming arrows of the evil one. Shield? Scott nearly shouted. You said shield! Yeah, Becca nodded toward the verse. Shield of faith. That's it! What's it? Just like in the dream, he continued. I didn't have my shield in that bookshop, so I got clobbered, just like in the dream. What are you talking about? Becca demanded. You have faith, you have a shield. No. Scott spun around to her. I put my faith in what the Ouija board said. When I was there, the board convinced me I was talking to Dad. I believed what the board said instead of what the Bible said. I let down my faith. I dropped my shield. And got clobbered. Exactly, Scott exclaimed. In the dream, it was a physical with the football players. But in the bookshop, it was spiritual. Becca began to nod. Go ahead, he said, motioning toward the Bible. Is there more? Anything else about the armor or shields or anything? She read on. Take on the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God. Yes! Scott could barely contain himself. Just like in the dream! Becca looked back at him. Don't you get it? Scott grabbed the book out of her hands. This is our sword. This is what we fight with. We don't just win because we're Christians. I strolled in there like some hotshot thinking because I was a Christian everything would go my way. But we have to use our shield and our sword. We have to believe God. That's our shield, and we have to use His word, he said, waving the Bible. Our sword! Rebecca nodded, then smiled. He was right. Isn't that incredible? Scott cried. It was all right here. All we had to do was read it. Again, Scott lay flat on his back in the middle of the football field. It was another crazy dream. Only this time he was wearing armor, just like his father's. I'm glad he finally suited up. His dad chuckled as he reached down and pulled him back to his feet. It took me a while to catch on, Scott grinned. I tell you, for my imagination, you sure were vague about all this. Not really. His dad slapped him on the shoulder. It's right here in the playbook. You just had to be reminded. With that, the man turned and headed toward the locker room. Hey, Scott called after him. Where are you going? The game's over. You learned your lesson. But what about those kids? Scott motioned toward the other team. What about the members of the society? What do you care? You got the truth now. That's all that counts. The man had a point. Why should Scott care? He learned his lesson. He learned the truth. What difference did it make that what they thought? After all, these were the kids responsible for locking him in the locker, for hitting him in the head with the baseball. If they wanted to fool around with fire, let him get burned. What did he and he suddenly saw them. Over at the line of scrimmage. But this time the shadows were gone, and they were no longer giants. Now they looked like frightened kids. Meaty Guy, the redhead, and Brooke, the leader. They were all huddled together and seemed to be searching the field for someone, for anyone. Suddenly the words Becca spoke earlier rang in his ears. They're not the enemy. They're victims of the enemy. He tried to ignore the thought. He tried to look away, but for some reason he couldn't. Then slowly, one after another, the faces turned toward him. Meaty Guy, Brooke, the redhead. Soon all their eyes were locked on his. They almost seemed to be pleading, to be begging. They didn't want to play anymore. It was obvious. They wanted to stop the game. They wanted to go home. Dad, Scott called, unable to take his eyes from the kids. Dad, someone needs to tell them. They need help. You just want to show off again, his dad laughed lightly. No, I'm serious. The man continued walking away. Please, I want to help. I mean that. The man came to a stop, but he did not turn his face to his son. They need someone to tell them, Scott repeated. I know I was full of pride. I know I was showing off before, but just look at them. The man did not turn. A tightness formed in Scott's throat. He wasn't sure if it was anger at his dad or pity for his kids. Or for the kids. Maybe it was both. Will you look at them? He shouted. They've got to be warned. The man still did not move. Aren't you listening? Scott cried. Don't you care? Then ever so slowly, the man turned. There was a faint twinkle in his eyes. He began to nod. Scott wasn't sure, but somehow it felt like he'd just gone through another test. Only this time he passed. How? Scott stammered. What can I do? How can I help? The man looked on, saying nothing. Please, Scott said. Tell me straight. No riddles this time. Just tell me. His father opened his mouth. He said only one word, but it was enough. Prayer. Scott shot up in bed, wide awake. He wasn't covered in sweat this time, but he was filled with determination. Becca, wake up. She mumbled. She was trying to say it's 4:30 in the morning, leave me alone, jerkface. But at the moment, was the best her mouth could come up with. 20 minutes later, the two of them were in her room with their Bibles open and were poring over every verse they could find about prayer. This is it, Scott finally cried. I knew it was here. He began to read. And I tell you that whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you set free on earth will be freed in heaven. Bind? Rebecca repeated. Like tie up? Yeah, Scott nodded. Like demons or spirits. And whatever we free? Probably like angels and God's power and stuff. Rebecca nodded. There's more. Listen. Again I tell you that if two of you on earth agree about anything you ask for, it will be done for you by my Father in heaven. Rebecca shook her head. What's wrong? How could we have been so stupid and to try and do all this stuff without even praying? Well, we're not stupid anymore. What time do you have? Scott asked. Almost 6. Then let's get to it. To what? There's 2 of us, right? Right. And it says if 2 of you agree on anything. You want to start praying for the society? Rebecca asked incredulously. Scott nodded. The society? Julie, your friends, everybody. Binding the spirits that are trying to hurt them and loosing God's power to protect them. Rebecca gave him a look. That's a lot of praying. You read it yourself. That's where the power is. Becca hated admitting when Scott was right, but the guy had a point. A major point. Well, she said, taking a deep breath. Let's get started. That was the end of chapter 9. That was the end of chapter 9. Awesome. And that's the end of our little marathon. What did you think? That was pretty cool, was it not? My favorite part was when he finally understood everything and when he was like, oh my gosh, the armor! Ah! That was pretty cool. Oh, Lord have mercy. But that goes to show you how important it is to have the armor of God. Because if you don't, things like that will happen to you. I mean, I'm not saying that you're acting like Scott and being all prideful and thinking you're all that. But it's good to have your full armor on at all times. Because Satan, like a lot of people say, he be trying us. Honestly. Satan comes and tries to attack us in many forms. And that's why we need the armor. And that's why, my friends, this book is so good. And I have like all 4 of them, and I kind of haven't been doing that much. But I hope you and your families and everyone that you share it with enjoys it. Sorry I haven't been reading. I apologize. I'm going to get back into it. I pinky promise. And people who break pinky promises aren't really cool, so I pinky promise, okay? We're going to read more. I'm going to go ahead and end this live. And if you're watching on YouTube, God bless you wherever you are and whenever you're watching. So, I want you all to remember, always have the full armor of God on you at all times. If you need to look it up, those verses are found in Ephesians 6:10 to 18. Those are very good verses. Ephesians 6:10 to 18. If you ever need to look it up. And you can maybe see what exactly the Word of God says about it. Anyway, God bless you all. I hope you have a good night, good day, good afternoon, wherever you are. And may you remember that Jesus loves you. God bless you all. Bye-bye.